There's a moment early in The Grapes of Wrath that doesn't announce itself. The Joad family is being pushed off their land, not because they were lazy, not because they made bad choices, but because the banks needed the land. The tractors were cheaper than people, and the mathematics of survival had shifted in ways that had nothing to do with effort, character, or how hard anyone worked. Tom Joad's father, a man who built his entire identity around being a provider, a farmer, a man whose labor meant something, sits down in the dust and cannot move, because the story he told himself about how the world worked, the one his whole sense of self was built on, had just been revealed as a lie. And when that happens to a person, something goes very quiet inside them. You probably haven't been pushed off farmland by a Depression-era bank, but you know what it feels like to have done everything you were told to do: the degree, the work ethic, the delayed gratification, the plan, and arrive somewhere that looks nothing like what was described. To look around at the life you were promised and find that the numbers don't add up, the doors aren't open, and the rules you followed apparently applied to a different game entirely. That's not just financial stress. That's a specific psychological collapse that follows a broken promise. And it has a name, it has a shape, it has documented, understandable causes, none of which are your character, your effort, or your worth. That's what today's video is about, because most people are living through it right now, and nobody is naming it clearly. You and I were promised a life that wasn't vague. It had details. A degree leads to a stable career. Hard work leads to upward mobility. Doing what you're supposed to do leads to being able to afford the life your parents had or better. All these promises and details weren't just hopes. They were presented as operating instructions that said, follow these steps and get these outcomes. The contract was implicit, but it was real. You organized your choices around it. You made sacrifices for it. You told yourself a particular story about who you were becoming and where you were going. And then the math stopped working. The degree didn't open those doors. The career doesn't pay what it was supposed to pay. The housing market looks like a number you don't recognize. The retirement your parents managed feels like a fantasy from another era. When an expectation is small, its violation is disappointment. When an expectation is foundational, when you built your identity around it, structured your choices around it, delayed your life for it, its violation is something much more serious. It's a rupture. And ruptures don't just feel bad, they do specific things to the mind. Here's the first thing that happens. Your brain holds two things that cannot both be true at the same time. The reality of, I did everything right and the outcome is wrong, doesn't work together. One of those has to give. For most people, especially people who were raised to believe in individual responsibility and meritocracy, the brain resolves that dissonance in a particular direction. It decides the second statement must mean the first was false. Your brain concludes that maybe you didn't do everything right, that maybe the failure is yours. This is cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs and choosing the most self-damaging direction available as a means of resolution. You didn't fail the system, but you start to believe the system failed because of you. Notice this in the Joads. They don't arrive in California angry at the banks, at the machinery of capital that displaced them, at the structural conditions that produced their situation. They arrive confused, ashamed, turning the failure inward, wondering what they did wrong, whether they were enough. Steinbeck, the author, understood something that most economists miss. Systemic failure doesn't present itself to the people living through it as systemic. It presents itself as personal. And that misdirected blame, that quiet inward collapse, is one of the most psychologically costly things a broken promise can do. The second thing that happens is subtler, and in some ways more damaging. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness showed something precise. When a person's actions repeatedly fail to produce expected outcomes, the brain stops drawing a causal connection between effort and result. This doesn't happen permanently or irreversibly, but the neural pathway that says doing this produces that gets weaker every time effort is followed by nothing. This is what explains a particular kind of paralysis that a lot of people in this generation recognize. It is not laziness or apathy. It is a deep, bone-level uncertainty about whether trying is worth it, about whether effort changes anything, about whether the game has rules that actually reward the people playing them honestly. The Jodes keep moving west, always west, toward the promise of California, the promise of work, the promise that somewhere the system still functions the way it's supposed to. And each arrival that doesn't deliver takes something out of them. Not their will exactly, but their certainty, their trust that the map is real. That erosion of trust in effort, in systems, in the idea that the rules work is learned helplessness developing in real time. And it doesn't mean giving up. It means going through the motions, applying for things without expecting them to come through, making plans while half believing they won't work, living in a permanent low-grade anticipation of the next disappointment. That's not a personality type. That's a nervous system that has updated its model of how the world works based on the evidence it has been given. Another thing that almost never gets said about this is the grief that comes along. When the life you were promised doesn't arrive, you are allowed to grieve it. Not in a performative way, not dramatically, but genuinely, you grieve in private, just the way you grieve anything real that you lost. Because you lost something. You have lost the future you organized yourself around, the one you made choices for, deferred things for, built an identity in anticipation of. That future is gone. And even though it was always imagined, even though it was always a projection, the loss of it is real. Psychologists call this anticipatory grief, when it's about a future that hasn't arrived yet, and disenfranchised loss when it's about something society doesn't recognize as a legitimate thing to mourn. There's no funeral for a broken social contract, no ritual for grieving the career that didn't materialize, the financial stability that stayed out of reach, the life stage you were supposed to hit that keeps receding. Nobody sends flowers when a generation discovers that the math doesn't work. So the grief goes unnamed, and unnamed grief doesn't disappear. It becomes a low-level atmospheric weight, the ambient sense that something has gone wrong, that you're behind, that there's a version of your life that was supposed to exist and doesn't. Ma Jode carries this through the entire novel. Not loudly, not in a way that stops her moving, but you can feel the weight of what she's quietly accepting, the ongoing surrender of one expectation after another, and the toll of absorbing that surrender for everyone around her. That's what unacknowledged grief looks like when it's worn quietly. Now let's discuss the deepest layer, your identity, your sense of who you are. This is not only built from your past, it's built from your anticipated future, from the story you tell yourself about where you're going and what that means about you. When that future becomes inaccessible, the identity built around it becomes unstable. This is why the Jode men, particularly Tom's father and uncle, lose more than land. They lose legibility. They no longer know who they are in a world that has no use for what they built their identity around. The farmer without land, the provider who can't provide, the man with a work ethic and no work. The external situation changed, But the internal collapse is about narrative, about the story of a self suddenly having no coherent ending. This is what happens to people in this generation who built their identity around becoming something, a particular career, a particular financial reality, a particular adult life, and then found that version of the future unavailable. The question underneath the financial stress isn't just, how do I afford this? It's, who am I if the life I was supposed to have doesn't happen? That question doesn't get asked out loud often, but it runs underneath almost everything. It runs under the anxiety about falling behind, the compulsive comparison with peers, the difficulty of being present in a life that doesn't feel like the one that was supposed to be happening. So here's the thing Steinbeck is pointing at through the entire novel, and the thing that matters most for anyone living through this right now. There is a difference, a critical, psychologically important difference between I failed and I was failed. The Jodes didn't fail, the promise failed, the system failed, and the gap between what was described and what was delivered is not a verdict on their character or their effort or their worth as people. But that distinction is almost impossible to hold on to from the inside, because we live inside individual lives, inside individual skulls, experiencing individual consequences. The systemic nature of the failure is abstract. The personal experience of it is concrete and immediate, which is why it matters deeply and practically to be able to identify it clearly. You were told a particular story about how life works. You organized yourself around it. You made real sacrifices based on it. And the story turned out to be about a world that no longer exists, or perhaps never quite existed in the way it was described. That is not a reflection of your worth. It is not evidence that you don't deserve the life you want. It is the experience of being part of a generation that inherited promises that the economic conditions couldn't keep. The Jodes keep moving, not because California delivers what they were promised, because it doesn't, but because moving is what is left when staying still means accepting the verdict that the failure was personal. The mind, given the right framing, can hold that distinction. The mind can recognize that something failed and it wasn't me. Holding that is not delusion. It is not bypassing the real material difficulty. It is the difference between carrying financial stress and carrying financial stress plus shame plus a collapsing sense of self. You only have to carry the first one. The other two were never yours to begin with. Thank you for watching. If you found value, share in the comments your thoughts and opinions about today's subject matter. We will like to hear from you. Please like and subscribe to support the channel. And if you know someone who will benefit from this video, send it to them. See you in the next one.